Welcome to another episode of Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about the rift between President Donald Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump is in the Middle East this week, striking big deals and perhaps pushing for an end to the war in Gaza. We'll see what kind of announcements or statements he makes. And his moves ahead of the big trip generated some tensions between the U.S. and Israel. After that, we'll discuss the Russia Ukraine talks scheduled to happen tomorrow in Istanbul. We are taping on Wednesday, a little after 1:30 p.m. Finally, we'll hear from Jude Russo, our go to Catholic correspondent, about the new American Pope. And if we have time, we'll discuss the good inflation numbers that came out this week and what that says about Trump's tariffs and the media freakout that Joseph and I at least participated in. I want to remind our listeners on podcast apps that you can watch a video of the episode on YouTube, so please subscribe to the American Conservative YouTube channel. Okay, so let's talk Middle East stuff. Trump is in the region, as I said, for a tour of the Gulf states. It's the first major overseas trip of his second term, although he did visit Rome for the funeral of Pope Francis. Trump is definitely getting the red carpet treatment. And during a speech in Saudi Arabia, Trump had a good line that I'll read, quote, "In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves." I actually think he said interventionalists. He seemed a little tired in that speech. Actually, the entire kind of American delegation looks a little exhausted. But it was a good speech, and a lot of people are pointing to that line because Trump seemed to make a clean break from not just the neocons, but all varieties of interventionists. A lot of people have been talking about how this trip seems to have coincided with a notable breakdown in the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, with the White House, for example, bypassing Israel and negotiating directly with Hamas to get the last American hostage released from Gaza earlier this week. So, Jude, what are your thoughts today on Trump and the Middle East?
There's so much to say. So I think that starting with the breakdown with relations in Israel is as good a place to begin as any. There has been in this administration a fairly vocal faction that emphasizes that American national interests may be distinct from Israeli national interests, and particularly from the specific interests of Benjamin Netanyahu, who, for various domestic political reasons, like wanting to stay out of jail, very much wants to stay in power, and so far as anyone can tell, sees the various interventions that Israel is involved in right now as the sort of best vehicle for getting that done. At the same time, it has been noted that Trump's relations with the Gulf states have never been flying higher. Qatar is giving a big airplane for the new Air Force One, which some people are saying is gross corruption. Right now, if you're on the Twitter or the whatever other social media, it's sort of big concern is Qatar's foreign influence operation, which I think is, fair sort of as far as it goes. Every other rich foreign nation has a foreign influence lobby in Washington. You never really hear about the Israeli lobby from these folks, but there is one. Qatar has a lobby, Kuwait has a lobby, the Saudis have a lobby, the Turks have a lobby, even the Hungarians have a lobby. So relations are quite good between Trump and the Gulf states right now. This all is sort of happening in the background to two major American interests in the Middle East. The first is cutting a deal with Iran, figuring out how to stabilize our relations with Iran, how to keep Iran from getting the bomb, and do this in a way that is not overtly embarrassing to America, the way that critics of the JCPOA under Obama felt that deal was embarrassing to America. The second one is the pacification of Syria, following the Turkish-backed rebels seizing power from Bashar Assad and sending him packing to Moscow, there have been questions about what the post-war settlement in Syria is going to look like. There have been ugly massacres against various minority groups, but Shara, who is previously Jolani, renamed himself and started wearing suits. The interim president is talking a big game about a more liberal, although still Islamist Syrian state. Trump actually met with Shara, shook his hand, said that he was good looking and tough and smart. The usual sort of Trump epithets that you expect when he's trying to get something out of somebody. Um, so I think that as far as the Iran stuff goes, a big portion of this trip is going to be devoted to just showing American goodwill in the region rather than a propensity for lobbing bombs, while also making sure that United States interests are still kept distinct from regional interests. Iran is a long running regional rival to Saudi. Um, and hopefully, Joseph is going to talk a little bit about the weird bank shot that is being floated for sort of co opting the Saudi Iranian tension. Um, but we still have troops in Syria, to get back to that second point. We're trying to get them out. We would like the place to stop being a war torn basket case. Uh, if the Turks and the Syrians and the Israelis really sort of keep throwing down, that is unlikely to happen. We are probably going to keep a presence there to make sure ISIS doesn't return. Um, to this end, Shara has proposed more or less ceding the Golan Heights to Israel, which is already fait accompli. So that's, I think, a fairly easy lift on the Syrian side. He's talked about giving exclusive oil, gas, and mineral rights to the United States. So there's a lot going on. And while I'm sort of hesitant to stick my neck out on a Thursday afternoon, because everybody knows everything good happens at 6 p.m. on Friday, things are looking pretty optimistic as far as the American position in the Middle East goes.
Yeah, and it's Wednesday afternoon.
Oh, it is Wednesday
Um,
afternoon. Excuse
yeah, there's on the Shara meeting. I think Shara also floated the idea of Trump Tower in Damascus, and Trump interestingly said that Shara had a strong past, which is kind of a funny way to describe the head of the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria that became HTS. Joseph, what do you want to add?
Think it's really interesting. Trump recently just announced that he's going to lift the sanctions off of Syria, uh, which is a sensible position, really, because the sanctions were put in to pressure the Assad government, which no longer exists. So it makes sense that we would get rid of those. But there's certainly been a lot of skepticism in the West around Shara and HTS because it is an Al Qaeda affiliate, or was at least in the past. And so there's a question of, how reliable these is this government actually going to be? Is it just going to end up being the same old thing? Uh, and so should we really try to engage with it? I think it makes sense to give Shara a chance. Uh, and so I think that was a perfectly reasonable move in Syria. Certainly, we should do everything we can to try to make sure that the Syrians actually have a fair shake at not being a war-torn basket case, as Jude put it. Um, and then Jude also brought up the very interesting proposal with the Iran deal that was sort of leaked out that was sort of floated in a Bloomberg report recently, which is this idea that Iran and Saudi Arabia and I believe the UAE will share essentially the Iranian nuclear program as part of this deal, which is a very interesting uh, a very interesting proposal in many ways. Iran and Saudi Arabia are sort of the two big axes in the Sunni and Shia competition in the Middle East. Both have been regional rivals for a long time. And so it makes sense that if they are sharing the same nuclear program, especially if they both have engineers and staff on site, that would tamp down on a lot of the possibilities for any kind of shenanigans as far as nuclear enrichment and building nuclear weapons goes, because Iran does not want Saudi Arabia to have nuclear weapons, and Saudi Arabia does not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. Um, and so, the more external eyes on the facilities there are, the less likelihood that you are going to have any kind of unforeseen nuclear breakout, as it were. The possibility of that actually happening are pretty questionable. Would the Iranians and the Saudis actually agree to this kind of deal? What kind of details are necessary for the whole thing to work out? Um, Still, it's barely a concept, but it's extremely interesting that this kind of thing is being floated out there, when previously something like that would have been incomprehensible. And I think it really has a lot to do with the fact that Trump just has an instinctive grasp of the way that the Gulf states conduct diplomacy. They know how to appeal to him, he knows how to appeal to them. They have very similar political instincts, and you can see this come out, when Trump goes over and does diplomacy with the Gulf states. It seems like he really understands that kind of politics, and it works out between them. So it's honestly very funny, if you ask me. But as far as negotiation in the Middle East, only Nixon could go to China. Maybe only Trump can go to the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I believe this proposal about the kind of consortium of Middle Eastern countries who would sort of jointly, share and operate Iran's nuclear energy program. I believe the proposal came from someone on the Iranian side. You mentioned that this kind of thing would have been incomprehensible in the past, and I think that's a good point. Probably the biggest geopolitical difference between now and the Obama years when Obama negotiated the original Iran nuclear deal is that Saudi Arabia is much more open to Iran having a nuclear program. China uh, it kind of brokered this rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We've seen the Saudi foreign minister go to Tehran to meet with Iranian leaders. I think a Saudi minister of some sort, some elite in the government, said just today that he expressed an openness to the idea of Iran having a nuclear energy program and of not going to war with Iran. So this is quite an interesting development because the Saudis were one of the main groups that were pushing against the JCPOA. It wasn't just a domestic political opposition that Obama faced. He had to also deal with the Gulf states, whereas Trump doesn't have to do that this time. I want to plug a piece that I wrote called Trump's Huge Middle East Opportunity, where I talk about Trump's visit to, this tour of the Gulf states, because I have a lot that I want to say about it, but I don't really have time now, so people can go read that. But on this issue of the Netanyahu Trump rift, one of the most interesting things that happened, or that was reported to have happened in recent days, is that Witkoff apparently talked to Israeli families of hostages held by Hamas, and he told them basically that their government was the reason that their loved ones hadn't yet been released. He said that the Israeli government is pushing for the continuation of this war, but it's not clear what progress can be made, and they should get a hostage deal. And this is a very significant act, I think, by the Trump administration because Trump is more popular than Netanyahu in Israel. He's very popular among Netanyahu's supporters. Getting a ceasefire that comes with a hostage deal is more popular among Israelis than continuing the Gaza war. So, this move by the Trump administration, by Witkoff, really puts Netanyahu on thin ice. It kind of signals to him that the Trump administration is willing to make things politically difficult for him. I mean, we're really seeing kind of an end to the no daylight policy that has kind of governed U.S. Israel relations since like LBJ. I mean, there has sometimes been daylight, especially under, for example, the first George Bush. But for the most part, we don't see this kind of rift between a U.S. president and Israeli prime minister kind of break out into the open. And there's been other examples. You mentioned the sanctions relief. when Netanyahu came to the Oval Office most recently, he was pretending that he wanted to talk about tariffs, but really he wanted to talk about Middle East policy, about diplomacy with Iran. And he also apparently encouraged the White House not to lift sanctions on Syria because Israel, even though the new Syrian leader is kind of making noises like he wants to have some sort of good relations with Israel, Israel doesn't trust him, doesn't trust his group, kind of wants to keep Syria weak until it has a definitely pro-Israel government, I suppose. But Trump just went ahead and did it anyway. And it makes sense. It would have been ridiculous not to. Those sanctions were against Assad. They were supposed to weaken Assad. They worked. So Assad is gone. It's kind of weird to maintain them on the government that replaced Assad. It also is a signal to Iran that sanctions don't just go on, they can come off. Because presidents often don't realize that. They think it's a one-way ratchet. So I think that that's a great move. It seems to be very popular in America, not only among MAGA types, but even among like the Pod Save America guys. We're saying this is a great thing. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post, who can often be quite hawkish, said that this was a great thing. It didn't make sense to continue the sanctions. So Trump is willing to kind of defy Israel right now, and that shows to me that the Trump administration has concluded that they can't really accomplish what they want in the Middle East, um, unless they have some sort of separation with Israel. So we'll see if it continues. Jude, what do you want to say? Any last words about this kind of BB Trump rift?
Something that I think is worth keeping an eye on is Trump's relationship with Turkey, who is the other major player in Syria right now. They did more or less sponsor HTS to power. Turkish security forces are more or less running large portions of Syria's government right now. The fact that Trump has a very strong relationship with Erdogan, for better or worse, I think factors into the decisions that are being made. Um, you know, Trump is somebody who likes to make deals because deals make people money, and throwing bombs only ever loses money. Um, and I think that he does not come in with preconceptions about the sorts of people he should be making deals with. I think he has a sort of instinctual sense that Turkey is a major player here. Turkey does have major concerns, and that Turkey, under Erdogan's leadership, is a country he can play ball with, even though it is a place with distinct interests from the United States. So I think that that's worth keeping an eye on. There have been a lot of domestic changes in Turkey that sort of factor into this, but I think tend to promote Trump's line in Syria. I think the other thing to keep an eye on is whether Shara actually delivers on the promises. It's inconceivable, I think, that Syria has a sort of Western-style secularist government. I think that, in the heart of the Ummah, you're going to have an Islamist government, whether you like it or not. But if he does actually crack down on, for example, massacres against the Alawites, if he does find a way to, accommodate the Druze, to accommodate the Kurds, that sort of shows a willingness to actually go along with what America's pushing for in the area. Whereas if he doesn't do those things, it seems like it may be another classic case of the United States jumping at a well-handicapped horse only to find that the thing can't run. So, everything is conditional. Nothing is set in stone. But I think those are a couple factors we haven't talked about at length here that are worth keeping an eye on.
It does speak well for Shara and his government, though, that they were able to sign deals with the Druze and to integrate the SDF, which was a surprise, I think, to a lot of people. Wasn't expected that the SDF would just essentially hand over the government and agree to join a unified Syrian government under Shara. So,
Well, yeah, and I
those
mean,
are promising.
it's very promising. Details still need to be worked out over what that's actually going to look like. The memorandum of understanding that got signed guarantees some sort of decentralized government in Kurdistan. Once again, Sharat actually has sort of followed through with that, or the SDF is going to continue doing what it has been doing for 15 years at this point. SDF also is sensitive to political dynamics in Turkey because of its Turkish affiliates, which decided to disband this week, and also dynamics in Iraqi Kurdistan. Something that Americans don't understand well is that the Kurdish bloc is not monolithic, and the Kurdish forces that we have supported in Syria, we armed and funded SDF, are exceptional within Kurdistan. It's a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary group that is based around a cult of personality, around Abdullah Öcalan, who has been imprisoned in Turkey for years and years and years at this point. It would be a bit like if China deciding to get involved in, the post-United States American theater, decided to back the Revolutionary Communist Party of the United States. They're weird. Nobody really likes them. They do not play nicely with others within their own ethnic bloc. And it's not actually clear that what they think is a sort of ideal future for Syria has anything to do with what the United States thinks an ideal future for Syria looks like.
Yeah, before we go to Russia, Ukraine, I just want to add one more thing on this kind of Trump-Bibi rift, because I think, if I was giving advice to Israel and to the Israeli government, with Israeli interests in mind, I would tell them they really need to get back on Trump's good side. And that means they probably need to compromise on some of their objectives, because they're really headed for total diplomatic isolation if they don't. I mean, the German foreign minister recently came out with this comment about how the Gaza war is totally immoral and it needs to stop. Macron and the French government released a very harsh statement, saying pretty much the same thing. So Western Europe is kind of getting sick of this war. Their populations definitely are. The Gulf states have turned sharply against Israel since the Gaza war started. They were kind of moving toward a rapprochement of some kind with Israel under the aegis of the Abraham Accords. And all of that has changed. And if even Trump now is kind of turning on Israel, I don't know how real it is. I think he's trying to send a strong political signal. But when he did this with Zelensky, it required Zelensky to compromise and kind of come back on side to make a move on his own end before Trump said, okay, no, we're cool with Zelensky again. I think the same thing needs to happen with Bibi. If he gets the U.S.-Iran war that he clearly wants, in American popular opinion, that's going to be bad for Israel, because Israel is going to be blamed for that war. And, it's already the case that a majority of Americans express an unfavorable view of Israel. So I really think that Israel needs to wrap up this Gaza war and have a more compromising stance, because they're kind of headed for a terrible geopolitical situation, in my view, if they don't make some sort of change now.
And this shift in the Gulf against Israel is not primarily ideological, it's primarily material. None of the Gulf states want to deal with large numbers of Palestinian refugees. Every time a Gulf state has taken in large numbers of Palestinian refugees, it has been a nightmare, because they continue agitating against Israel from their Gulf hideouts. And then they also tend to agitate against the governments that are hosting them. Yasser Arafat supported the overthrow of the Kuwaiti royal family in the 80s or whenever it was. So I think that something that really needs to be reconsidered is what the day after in Gaza is going to look like. Right now, Israel has a plan to more or less clear Gaza, build some really big refugee camps, and clear the area. And it's not clear to me that any of the Gulf states are going to get on side for that. Not out of any compassion for the Palestinians, whom they all sort of dislike and regard as troublemakers, but because they don't, if 100,000 Palestinians move to Jordan, that's hugely destabilizing. If 100,000 Palestinians move to Qatar, that is hugely destabilizing.
Yeah, definitely. And the populations of these Gulf states are, they have become more anti-Israel. That's why the Gulf leaders think, okay, now is not the right time to have this Abraham Accord agreement with Israel. But I think we need to move on to Russia-Ukraine. So, as I mentioned, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are scheduled to meet tomorrow, Thursday, May 15th, in Istanbul for peace talks. Trump played a major role this weekend in making this meeting happen. He's been pushing for a 30-day ceasefire, which Putin has rejected because Russia has the battlefield advantage. It doesn't want to lose the leverage that comes from that. So, Moscow wants a peace deal that addresses what it calls the root causes of the war rather than an unconditional ceasefire. But this weekend, Trump and some European leaders were making a lot of noises about Putin's intransigence, and Putin agreed on Saturday night not to a ceasefire, but to direct talks with Ukraine. Zelensky was initially dismissive, but Trump published a Truth Social post saying that Zelensky should take Putin's offer of direct talks, which Zelensky did less than an hour later. Zelensky went a step further and challenged Putin to meet him personally. And then after that, Trump suggested that he could also attend the meeting. Although, Putin, I highly doubt he's going to attend. I think I even read earlier he's sending lower level officials instead. So, Joseph, what's your level of optimism about these talks, about Trump's diplomacy, and about the prospects for peace in Ukraine in the next several months?
Or, I mean, the Trump administration has been pushing really hard for these talks, but frankly, I don't see that any fundamental change in the situation has taken place. The main thing that is really keeping Russia at the table is Putin kind of wants to avoid any total break or estrangement with the United States because, he recognizes that in any peace settlement, the United States is ultimately going to be involved. And so, he wants to make sure that the Trump administration doesn't just walk away and throw the towel and say, okay, like, we're not going to have anything to do with stuff, you know, uh, relations in Europe between Russia and Ukraine anymore. Um, but I don't think that the Russians are in any hurry to come to any kind of agreement. They've slow walked this as much as they possibly can, and they are working as hard as they can, it seems, to kind of stretch this out as much as possible and get the maximum leverage and advantage that they possibly can on the battlefield. Um, so I am pretty skeptical that there will be much progress. Putin doesn't seem that interested in progress either. Again, he just seems to be testing the limit of what's necessary to keep the US barely engaged. Um, and so I'm pretty pessimistic as far as any chances of any real settlement.
Jude?
In January, I wrote a column saying peace in Ukraine, Russia by middle of the year. So I feel sort of obligated to defend that position. Um, I do. So while acknowledging what Joseph said, it is not enormously clear to me that Russia has a whole lot more to gain on the battlefield without incurring really catastrophic costs. I mean, we're 3 years in here. What was supposed to be a very quick, relatively surgical strike to decapitate the Ukrainian government has devolved into a World War I style land war. Um, it's not, while the Ukrainians definitely have the short end of the stick right now, it's not clear to me that any sort of Russian military breakthrough is close over the horizon. Um, Sanctions are, in fact, hurting the Russian economy. It's not destroying the Russian economy. And, I'm happy to sort of talk about the efficacy of our sanctions program against Russia, which has kind of been wanting. But it does hurt. We're putting more punitive sanctions on Russia. because of their intransigence at the negotiating table. And I do think that at some point Putin is going to cut bait and say that's good enough. Especially given that the U.S. proposal is American recognition of Russian claims in Crimea, major sticking point. The Russians already have the majority of the contested provinces in Ukraine. So if we freeze the battlefield line where it is, which is part of the American proposal, it's not as if the Russians continuing to push is going to get a lot more territory in the short term. So I'm sort of modestly optimistic for the Istanbul talks. I think that what sort of surprises me is that there is not a proposal to just do a referendum in the relevant provinces at this point, which would overwhelmingly favor Russia, has the veneer of self-determination over it. I think it would be hard for Western diplomats to sort of counter that proposal, because this is the way that we've determined national borders since the First World War. So we'll see. I think that Russia might have one or two more tricks in its diplomatic bag to get this wrapped up. The fact that Trump is so personally invested in getting it wrapped up, I think, is good. I think that it's a cause for optimism. But as Joseph says, the Russians are not going to go into that night quietly. I think that they're going to see what they can get. So I think insofar as Istanbul is going to be another iteration of, ticky-tacky, figuring out the particulars of what a deal could look like, it's progress, but I'm not expecting a peace proposal to emerge this weekend. But Andrew, you were at Track 2 talks with Russians a couple weeks ago, so maybe you have better insight into this than either Joseph or I do, just sort of surveying the English language press.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the podcast last week that those talks left me more pessimistic than I had been previously about the prospects for peace, just because, as I said, the Russians seem to be driving a hard bargain. But to a point that I think each of you alluded to, and that I know Joseph said, they also seemed very interested in better bilateral relations. It's not just that they don't want there to be this break from the US, but Trump has put on the table the possibility of a broader rapprochement and cooperation. And I think that was very smart of the Trump administration early in the second term to do that when they met in Riyadh with Russian officials and wanted to talk about restoring the entire complex of US Russia relations, as one Kremlin spokesman put it. The reason I think that was smart is because, when Trump threatened to walk away from talks, a lot of people said, well, this is just like a threat against Ukraine. Like, this is bad for Ukraine if Trump walks away, and it's good for Russia because America is the backer of Ukraine, and it wasn't clear if walking away meant ceasing military aid to Ukraine. But I think one thing we've seen since that threat was made is that the Russians really do care about getting better relations with the US. They've given up on Europe, and at these Track 2 talks, the a constant theme from nearly all of the participants on the Russian side was that they really hate Europe. There's a lot of mutual antipathy there. They don't want to work with Europe. They just want to work with the U.S. because they think that Trump presents an opening for better relations. So with that carrot on the table, I think we have some leverage. We have limited, leverage in terms of the sticks in our arsenal to kind of coax them to the negotiating table and to actually get a peace deal. I think that the Pentagon is worried about American stocks, military stocks. It was interesting. We refurbished a Patriot missile system that had been in Israel and sent it to Ukraine. I thought that was revealing. It was kind of a signal maybe to Israel, but also to Russia, that we still do want to give some military support to Ukraine so that they aren't totally overwhelmed at some point. But we had to refurbish an existing thing that was already, out of our stockpile and in Israel. So I think that might be one reason that Trump, even though he's threatening more sanctions, is not clearly threatening to send more weapons. Um, Putin might be trying to wait out the US on that score because our weapons shipments are scheduled to run out in the next few months, I believe. Um, and as far as, whether Russia could gain more militarily, a thing that you brought up, Jude, I think that they might have um, kind of residual goals to march on to Odessa and take that to kind of totally cut off the Black Sea from Ukraine. And they feel about Odessa the way that they feel about the Donbass and about Crimea, that it's a Russian city. Putin calls it that, a deeply Russian city. It plays a big role in kind of the Russian psyche. The peace deal that Trump proposed, I from my perspective, I think it's rational, and it has to be, something like that, unless Russia really does have the military force needed to march onto Odessa. Something like what the Trump administration proposed is going to be what a settlement looks like, where we formally recognize, okay, Crimea basically is Russian. The history of it going to Ukraine is sort of strange. Basically, Khrushchev just, when it was an oblast, just transferred it to Ukrainian authority during the time of the Soviet Union. He was born in Ukraine, so maybe that figured it into his strange decision that no Russian has ever really understood. The people there clearly are Russian identified. And then another part of the deal is to give de facto recognition of Russian control over the Donbass, which basically means that no one is going to have to say that Russia owns the Donbass, but we're going to kind of defer that to the future. So Ukraine can have some hope of getting it back, but it can't militarily try to do so. Um, and then another part of it was, um, well, what else? I mean, one thing that was interesting is that it said that no NATO for Ukraine, which is also a given. They're not going to join NATO. NATO members have demonstrated their unwillingness to defend Ukraine by sending soldiers to fight Russia. But Ukraine could join the EU under that proposal. I think that opens up some interesting possibilities because there's a mutual defense clause in the EU founding charter. It doesn't require EU members to go to war for a member state that's been attacked, but to militarily defend it by to send weapons, which EU countries have demonstrated a willingness to do. And it also gives some hope to Ukraine of having, a better economy and to kind of become this westernized country that people to the west of the Donbass want Ukraine to be. So I think that makes sense. Maybe just one more point. I'm kind of curious from both of you. I mentioned U.S. military aid to Ukraine and how maybe Trump needs to signal that will continue indefinitely until a peace deal is reached. Probably a lot of people who favor realism and restraint in foreign policy don't want to do that. They don't think it's worth it. Joseph, do you think that Trump should signal that we're going to keep sending military aid to Ukraine if this thing isn't wrapped up in the next few months?
I think it makes sense. There are limited amounts of Bec originally, Trump was having quite a bit of a struggle with Zelensky to get him to fall in line, essentially, with American interests and making a peace settlement. That Zelensky seems to have recognized that essentially the jig is up, like there needs to be a peace settlement, and this is the only way it's going to happen. So now the major issue is convincing Putin, and there are a limited amount of tools in Trump's diplomatic toolkit that he can use to really put pressure on the Russians. And so, military aid is the most obvious one that we have. So I think it makes sense to use that. I don't think it's reasonable to walk away from essentially almost the only tool that you have to put pressure on Russia to make a peace settlement. Uh, because honestly, like, yes, it is uh, somewhat frustrating to send weapons to uh, a conflict that's probably not going anywhere. But I think as far as the cost goes, like it's easily worth it to the United States of America.
Jude?
I'm in a similar boat with the sort of caveat that diplomacy is largely about lying. Um, Russia has lost over 100,000 men on the battlefield, more if you include the wounded. This has been the primary pain point in this war for them, in addition to all of the sort of economic devastation from sanctions. I think that even just saying yes, the killings are going to continue until morale improves and you come up with a deal, uh, goes a long way. Even if I had no intention of sending further weapons to Ukraine at this point, I would not say that. I would say, obviously, I'm going to send more weapons to Ukraine because we want a deal. Uh, Even a Korea style peace would be an improvement over what we have now. And I think that, the way we got to a Korea style peace was the US pretty much showed an almost limitless and irrational appetite for backing the South Korean cause. Um, Whether we would actually follow through on that, famously, MacArthur wanted to start dropping nukes on North Korea when things started going a little bit pear shaped, and we didn't do that. But I think that
Sea of irradiated cobalt.
yeah, I think that sort of maintaining the maximalist position of we are going to keep hurting you until this stops makes sense diplomatically, irrespective of what you actually decide to do, which is not a unilateral decision by the president. Congress also has a say in where American money goes. Last time I checked the Constitution.
Right, yeah. Um, yeah, I agree with you both on that. It is interesting that Putin and Zelensky are kind of competing for Trump's affection right now. It was clearly a part of, this recent back and forth between them when Putin offered the direct talks and then Zelensky eventually did as well. So he's done a good job to kind of engineer this leverage over both of them. That's something that Biden wasn't able to do in either of the cases. So hopefully, right, he didn't try. He wasn't even willing to talk to Putin on the phone, which is ridiculous. But yeah, let's move on. So, Jude, our Catholic correspondent, what's up with the new US born and Creole descended Pope?
Yeah. Chicago Bob, as they're calling him. I'm called. Uh, he's a pope. He's the head of the billion strong Roman Catholic Church. Um, the Immediately upon his election, various sorts of media watchers, who are the lowest form of journalistic life, just full of Vatican watchers, started combing through his old tweets and retweets to figure out what his ideological alignments are and, is the new pope based or not? Um, which, going out on a limb is a little bit silly for the sovereign head of his own country, the Vatican City, and the spiritual head of a church that encompasses enormous parts of the world well outside the American the gravitational pull of American politics. Um, that said, he is, so far as anyone can tell, a moderate. He is both very strong on sort of the traditional Catholic social issues below the belt. He's very anti-abortion. He's very anti-gender theory in his previous statements. Um, he's somewhat softer on migration issues than perhaps the MAGA right would like, but my sort of read on that is that it's a little unreasonable to expect the head of the church that nationalism was invented to oppose to embrace the changing tides of nationalist sentiment in the West at any given time, uh, especially given that the nationalist sentiment uh, in the United States changes in insane ways every 10 minutes. It's not so long ago that Vivek Ramaswamy was talking about how we need to replace all of the lazy Americans with H-1B visa uh, immigrants, and that's the real nationalism of the future. Uh, he But laying aside sort of the substantive or ideological aspect of the Pope, I think that the promise here is one of normality, one of competent administration. Uh, I think that non-Catholics sort of underrate how weird a Pope Francis was. When he came out, he did not have on the traditional regalia of a pope, the mitzvah and all of that jazz. When he sat for his papal portrait, he did not wear the traditional regalia. He did not sign his name, Francis PP, for Papas. Uh, he, especially while Benedict was still alive as the Pope Emeritus, whatever that means, this was a matter of significant unheimlichness. It was uncomfortable for Catholics. It felt weird. Um, and, this Pope, traditional regalia, he's moving back into the papal apartments, which Francis had eschewed, instead setting up this weird little Argentinian fiefdom in Santa Marta. So I think that there will be a move towards détente within the church, an effort to present as a normal pope, whatever that means in the modern period. The fact that he is a canonist, he's an expert in the law that covers the church, suggests that we are at an end of the disco era of church governance, where Rome says weird stuff and everybody else sort of tries to figure out post hoc what that actually means as far as administration goes. I think that we are not going to see the constant reconstitution of the central administrative structures of the church. I think that there will be a painful but necessary evaluation of the Vatican fisc. The Vatican's broke. This was a recurring issue under all of the headlines with Francis. The Vatican is functionally bankrupt. And I think that it makes sense that they picked an American lawyer to balance the checkbook. If you were going to do fiscal austerity for the Catholic Church, are you going to pick another Italian or another Latin American, or are you going to pick an American or a German? So I think that as far as conservatives, American conservatives in the church goes, there were various candidates of desire who are out there, Robert Serra from Africa or Peter Erdo from Hungary. Realistically, none of those guys had a chance. They did not have any sort of real power base within the conclave of voting cardinals as it was constituted. This guy, though, does not look intent on kicking conservative Americans in the teeth every 2 weeks, which the old guy really enjoyed doing, really more than almost anything else. So I think, for a conservative American Catholic going into this new papacy, there's still a real sense of optimism. There's a sense that things are going to, if not be the way we would like them to be, certainly a lot better than they have been these past 12 years.
Yeah, and I'll say as an immigration restrictionist, I found it really silly that a lot of people were apparently expecting that the new pope would sound like Marine Le Pen on immigration. I mean, this guy is the head of, he's a spiritual leader of a universalist church that, in principle encompasses everyone, potentially at least. That doesn't mean that the heads of governments need to also be universalists, but his kind of role in the discourse is something different. So maybe if he influences politics, it's not by political leaders becoming universalists, but maybe in America, for example, instead of sending people to this terrorist detention facility in El Salvador, we can send illegal aliens just back to their home country and do so in a somewhat humane fashion that respects their rights as human beings. That would be a nice influence, I think. Joseph, what do you think about the new pope?
I mean, I already talked about him in the previous podcast. I think it's not being Catholic, it goes a little bit beyond me to have much of an opinion about the Pope. It's outside my wheelhouse. But I just wrote an article about the Pope's ministry in Latin America because I was asked to do that since Latin America is my thing. I don't think it's as well known, at least it hasn't been paid as much attention to in the American press, but I think it's very interesting and relevant that that the new pope served for some 30 years in Peru. He's a citizen of Peru, has been since 2014, um, and has spent pretty much his entire life as a priest, in South America, ministering to the many relatively impoverished and isolated communities in Peru. Um, and I think that's an interesting continuation with, or sort of a consistency with Pope Francis, who had a, who of course came from a Latin American background in Argentina and had a more pastoral perspective. Um, I think that's interesting. And so that also I think makes his election to the papacy a little bit less surprising, as far as a lot of people weren't expecting an American pope. The Catholic Church abroad has a somewhat strained relationship, I understand, with the Catholic Church in America. There's always been a very culturally distinct way that Catholics in America uh, approach things. And so the fact that, Cardinal Prevost at the time had spent a lot of time abroad in Latin America and therefore was culturally conversant, uh, and linguistically, I suppose, he speaks fluent Spanish, with other varieties of Catholicism, probably made him a much more palatable or familiar choice to a lot of the cardinals.
It's also encouraging that coming out of Peru, which is a fairly fraught part of Latin America, to say the least, these past 30 years, nobody hates his guts. Um, Something that, was largely ignored because the American press can't cover Latin America is that Francis, coming out of Argentina, uh, had weird sort of pre-existing beefs, both with various forms of government in Argentina. He was on the wrong side of the dirty war, and there was some bitter feeling about that. He handled certain abuse allegations within his archdiocese in a questionable fashion, and there was bad feeling about that. Nothing similar. I've seen nothing similar in hearing to Prevost. Uh, he had a good relationship with his traditional Latin Mass community in Peru, by all accounts. He came out of the Fujimori Shining Path civil war without anybody screaming for his skin. And I think that's encouraging. I think that,
He didn't endorse Marxism, which is good in Latin American Catholics.
as I said, the the media watchers who have dissected his social media presence have said, oh, he seems sort of modestly in favor of free markets, which is more or less what you would expect from a boy from the suburbs of Chicago who went to Catholic school. He doesn't have screwy ideas, at least by American lights, the way that perhaps the last guy, or at least his friends, had.
Yeah, I mean, the more we learn about him, the more apparent it becomes why he was, selected. Um, it's interesting that Chicago Bob is a White Sox and secondarily a Cardinals fan, from what I read, which is not the case for most Chicagoans. But I think Chicago is still proud. Chicago is the place where I've lived in the longest. I lived there for 8 years, 7 years. So let's go ahead and go out to our picks of the week to wrap this episode up. So these are attack articles from the past 7 days or so that we want to highlight. I'm going to pick Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute's piece on Iran. Trump should resist the zero enrichment fantasy. So this is about how the Trump administration has been sending these mixed signals about what it wants from Iran exactly in these nuclear negotiations, whether it just wants them to not have a nuclear weapon and to have some verification system so that we know they're not enriching to weapons grade uranium, or whether it actually wants them to fully dismantle their civilian nuclear energy program. Uh, Netanyahu is pushing for the latter. He calls it the Libya model. If anyone wants to see why that would not be palatable to the Iranians, they can go read the Wikipedia page for
Google
Muammar
Gaddafi.
Gaddafi. Exactly. So that was a good piece on Iran. Trump should resist the zero enrichment fantasy. Joseph?
Sure. We talked about Syria some. I think the new Syrian government is very interesting, so I'll go ahead and pitch Juan P. Villasmil, who's I know personally. He's a cool guy. Anyways, JP's piece in Syria, a narrow window for prudence and offshore balancing. Juan P. Villasmil.
And I will tout, we have a very strong week. They're all great. Please go read and subscribe. But I will tout W. James Antle's piece, Trump's Clean Break with the Interventionists, which just examines Trump's comments in Riyadh yesterday and how it's a repudiation of the neocon line on the Middle East and America's place in the world. Jim makes the good point that in this administration, unlike the last Trump administration, it kind of looks as if policy and personnel and rhetoric are actually lining up. So please go read it. Trump's Clean Break with the Interventionists.
I still need to read that one. I've been kind of busy today, but it sounds really interesting. So that's the end of our episode. I want to thank our listeners for watching until the end. If you're listening on podcast apps, a reminder you can go watch this on YouTube at the American Conservative YouTube channel. And I want to thank you, Jude, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.